Next, I want to talk about the physical environments of South America. And one thing that I'll highlight is that you have a wide range of physical environments, different kinds of climates, different types of plant environments because of a couple of factors. One, the wide range of latitude. So we talked about the things that affect climate. One is latitude, how far north or south you are. And South America is very long north and south. So you have tropical areas in the north extending to much colder areas in the south. Now, in the south, you're getting pretty close to Antarctica. In fact, when you get to the southern part of South America. What also has a huge impact is the elevation. You have the presence of the Andes Mountains here. This is one of the longest and highest mountain chains on Earth. So you have altitudinal zonation, which we've discussed, but you also have a massive rain shadow effect, which creates a desert on one side of the Andes Mountains. We'll talk about that as well. Now, within the Andes Mountains, you have something I want to highlight called antiplanos. These are high elevation valleys, and these are home to many indigenous societies. So I'm going to grab a picture here. This is a high, you can see the snowy peaks in the background. These are high flat areas up in the Andes Mountains, and these are really where you have a high concentration of indigenous people. This is part of the old Inca Empire at one time, and so we'll watch a film that kind of highlights this part of South America. And the other thing we'll highlight is two of the main features. We have the tropical rainforest of the Amazon basin, and then not too far away on the other side of the mountains, we actually have the driest place in the world, which is the Atacama Desert of northern Chile and a little bit into Peru. And then as we go further south, we have climates that are a little bit more like what we would find in North America. Because as you're going this far south, it's getting about as far south as the United States is and Canada is north. So we can divide the Earth into kind of different climatic zones and that have different kinds of seasonality. One is the tropics, and the tropics are areas where the sun is very directly overhead throughout the course of the year, and you don't have really have a winter time. You just really have warm conditions. You might have a dry and wet season, but you don't have a massive cold season like you do outside of the tropics in the mid latitudes. So here in the central, if we think of South America like an ice cream cone, the ice cream part is very tropical, but as you get down into the cone, you get into what's called the mid latitudes. The United States is also in the mid latitudes where we experience 4 seasons, summer, fall, winter, and so on. And so that's true up in where we live in North America, but also true in the cone part of South America. Now, one of the major tropical features of South America is the Amazon basin. This is the largest rainforest region in the world. You can see it here in green. This is the Amazon basin, huge area of tropical rainforest. Here's an image kind of showing the watershed itself. This whole area is just a massive tropical forest. This is the largest area of tropical forest in the world. Very densely vegetated. This is showing in the Amazon basin. You can see different layers of trees, a whole lot of different kinds of vegetation, very diverse vegetation as well. So you have large trees with dense canopies. The canopies have different layers to them. Some trees extend above the top, some trees exist below the main canopy. And you also have high amount of biological diversity. That tropical rainforests, while they only have 7% of the land area on Earth, they have about half of the world's species. And this is especially true in the Amazon basin because it's the largest rainforest area of the world. So this is showing biodiversity, meaning how many different kinds of species, plants, animals, insects. And the Amazon basin has the highest amount of biodiversity in the world. So we'll discuss that for a moment. What you have is you have a forest that consists of different layers. You have a main canopy and an understory and emergence. And you also have various types of vines, different types of plants that exist on the forest floor. For all these different kinds of plants, you have pollinating insects. So altogether, that makes a whole lot of different kinds of living things in this environment. Now, one thing I'll note about tropical rainforest is that the soil at the very top holds all of the nutrients. You have leaves that are shedding year-round, so they form kind of a layer of nutrients right on the top. But those nutrients don't ever really get a chance to make their way deep into the soil. So the very tops of the soil are very rich in nutrients, but when you get below there, it's very poor in nutrients. So it's one reason when you see some of the trees in the rainforest, they have these weird kind of wide roots because they're trying to absorb nutrients that are on the very top of the soil. This is showing two different types of soil. This is more of a tropical soil, and you can see there's not much coloration here. By contrast, this is a soil from the Great Plains of the United States, where the grasses will live and die and kind of make their way deep into the soil, giving a rich layer of nutrients that goes very deep. Here, the nutrients are really limited to the very top. So one issue in tropical rainforests is deforestation. And one way that their forests are cleared are for agricultural use. And some of this is done for subsistence agriculture. This is called shifting cultivation. So indigenous peoples who live in the Amazon basin, what they'll do often is clear an area so that they can create a garden. And sometimes it's also called slash and burn because they will slash the vegetation, they will burn it to give some extra nutrients into the soil. However, because the soils are nutrient poor, these will become depleted of nutrients after a few growing seasons. And so after that, what people have to do is abandon these gardens and move on to another place. That's why it's called shifting cultivation, because they have to shift to locations over time. And the impact to the rainforest itself is minimal because there's not as many people there's not a huge amount of people doing this. So with low population, this is a pretty low impact. In fact, the forest will actually reclaim these gardens after people leave. In fact, there are indigenous groups that are actually what's called uncontacted people, that people who don't have contact with the outside world, that people kind of live they keep to themselves deep within the rainforest. Now, that was subsistence agriculture. Commercial agriculture can have a heavier impact because of the scale of it. It's just much larger areas are cleared. There's a much larger area that's where the forest is cleared out for cattle ranching or growing soybeans. Some other parts of the world, there's things called palm oil plantations, but in Brazil, soybean farms are a really big threat to the rainforest. Soybeans, even though the soils aren't that rich, soybeans can actually get nutrients from the nitrogen in the air, so they're well adapted to these types of environments. So if they clear the rainforest, they can grow soybeans there. So this is showing the soybean growing area of South America, and you see that little kind of looks like a finger pointing in there. That's kind of meant to represent the extension of soybean farming into the tropical rainforest. Cattle ranching is another threat. Sometimes areas are cleared for cattle grazing, but oftentimes because of the poor soils, that these don't last very long. But because large areas are cleared, it's harder for the rainforest to recover that land. This is showing satellite imagery of changes to the rainforest. And it doesn't always happen in blocks. It happens kind of like a fishbone pattern where first loggers will go in, start clearing trees, and then farmers will kind of follow in behind them and kind of, kind of fan out into the rainforest. Now, one problem with commercial agriculture is it can disrupt the natural patterns of the rainforest. So where you have healthy rainforest, there's sort of a recycling thing going on where the rainfall will fall within the forest, and then that will the plants will transpire or evaporate that back into the air, and they'll kind of keep moving around in a loop. But if you clear out too many of the trees, you don't have the recycling of the moisture back into the air, and you have higher amount of runoff, and that can actually make the area more dry and make it difficult for the rainforest to grow back. And so what's happened in some parts of the rainforest is you have a depletion of the or disruption of the nutrient cycles. And this prevents, so if you have a small area, that's okay, the forest can grow back into it. But if you have a massive area, you've kind of disrupted the system. It's hard for that forest to come back. Why should you care? You lose some of that biodiversity that we mentioned. Rainforests have a lot of unique species. They are, some of these plants might be part of future medicines. And so this is just a resource that, deforestation is a real concern because of the loss of this biodiversity. All right, now one thing I want to highlight is the way winds move on the earth. We didn't talk too much about this in the climate section, but you have kind of two sets of winds. In the mid-latitudes, like where the North America is, you have what's called the westerlies, and these kind of winds that are blow like from the Pacific Ocean onto California. And we talked about how in North America, as winds come in and are blocked by the mountains, that creates a rain shadow in North America. Now in the tropics, winds blow in the opposite direction. So instead of coming from the Pacific here, they're coming from the Atlantic. These are called the trade winds. They're kind of moving in that opposite direction. So in North America here, you have winds coming in from the Pacific Ocean, going up over the Sierra Nevada, creating a dry rain shadow region behind it into Nevada, Utah, places like that. However, in South America, you have winds blowing in the opposite direction, so that the West Coast is actually is in the rain shadow of the Andes Mountains. So here, the wind is coming through here. The Amazon basin is very wet, but then once the air moves over the Andes Mountains and it comes back down, there's a strip of land on the other side that is in the rain shadow of the Andes Mountains. So here's just a comparison where our coastal areas in the US are quite wet, and the coastal areas, the Pacific coast areas of South America. So here we have the trade, here's a kind of another view of it. You have the trade winds, they're going up the Andes Mountains, and when they come back down, they create a rain shadow called the Atacama Desert. And there's some other factors too. There's cold water currents, it's windy there. But this creates the driest area in the world called the Atacama and Peruvian deserts. Sometimes we just call it collectively the Atacama. So it's along northern Chile, the country Chile, and southern Peru. And these are extremely dry because of that rain shadow effect that we've discussed, and also because of some other factors that really increase the aridity or dryness and make it one of actually the driest place on Earth. There's some places where there's a view of the Atacama Desert. There's some parts of the Atacama that have had no recorded rainfall on record.